My name is Vivian, and I just work here. For those of you whom I haven't met yet, I've been the office administrator here at UUCWF since last June. Opening a stewardship testimonial by saying, I just work here, hopefully comes off as funny or ironic, or maybe it's just making Reverend Marcia wonder why she asked me to do this. But it's true. In fact, I must admit this is my first time I've ever been here on a Sunday. It's the first time I've been to any church service in 6 years. It's the third time I've been to church since I've graduated high school in 2010. So if you're wondering how I ended up here, well, I do too sometimes. But my life has had more plot twists than a soap opera. I'll confess to you that I've told Reverend Marcia so many times that I'll eventually show up to a service. And believe it or not, I've even negotiated my Sunday shifts at my other job to start late enough that I can be here when I'm ready. I could tell you every reason why it is so hard for me to come to church, but it's probably for the best if the stewardship testimonial stays shorter than the sermon. I grew up a church brat. My father died in a whitewater rafting accident when I was 5 months old. My mother grew up Episcopalian, but the Lutheran church across the street from our house was easier to attend for a first-time mom who now had to care for an infant, work full-time to pay bills, and plan for a future that she never imagined. We found a home there. I was raised by a funky coalition of Lutheran church moms while my mother went to nursing school and worked. I went to the service and Sunday school every week, and when I was old enough, there was youth group and confirmation classes. I was an acolyte. I served communion. As I approached adulthood, I was able to understand more of our Christian ideology, and that's where the fairy tale ended. My congregation, like many Lutheran churches at the time, went through growing pains as they decided whether or not to become affirming to the LGBTQ community or not. Though I wasn't out as a transgender woman yet, not even to myself, the disdain that many church members demonstrated in that process felt alienating. My pastor called my discomfort wrestling with God. I thought of it more like a breakup, and it's not me, it's you. That was the end of the road for me as a spiritual person, at least for a very long time. In my early 20s, I graduated college with a bachelor's degree in chemistry. I went on to specialize in inorganic synthesis, nanomaterials, and eventually biophysics. I took home a nice salary before starting work on a PhD. I married my college sweetheart. I did everything right. And now you are no closer to understanding why I am your church office admin, let alone what any of this has to do with how much you pledged this year. I promise I'm getting there soon. My life went off the rails for about 6 years. I don't have the time or the courage to tell you all about it right now, but you're welcome to ask me about it sometime. Things got pretty dark. I forgot what I knew about chemistry. But it had been even longer since I had forgotten what it was like to be part of a supporting and loving community. After a long line of eclectic and mostly horrible jobs I've done in the past several years, I found myself in Reverend Marcia's office, interviewing for an admin job for which I had literally no experience. She took a chance on me. I'm still learning how to be an office administrator, but I think it's fair to say it's easier than acing quantitative foundations of modern biophysics, which, yes, is a real course that I have taken. I feel supported here. People are kind to me here. Here, I'm not intentionally misgendered or bullied. Here, if I'm crying in my boss's office, it's because Reverend Marcia cares enough to have a conversation about me, about my life. We don't know who else is going to land here, or what they will have gone through before they do. That's why we keep the circle open, right? Granted, most people aren't going to walk in these doors because they have a job interview, but maybe they'll be here to hear Stephanie, our awesome intern minister, give an inspirational sermon. Maybe they'll come for the beautiful songs that will echo in this sanctuary when we hire a music director. Maybe they'll attend AA meetings, folk time, or the living room downstairs. And all of that happens in this building, which, believe it or not, takes more than Scott's willpower to remain standing. All of this is supported by your pledges. For my part, I get to come to work and feel like I'm back around funky church moms, which, apologies to Marcia, Stephanie, Mary, and Barb, is because I actually am. UUCWF means something different to you, and I'm absolutely sure it will mean something else entirely to someone that you or I haven't even met yet during this upcoming financial year. Thank you so much.
Last summer during COVID, I reconnected with Peggy, an old friend of mine from grade school. We'd both undergone cancer surgery at the same hospital just a month apart. We really leaned on each other. I was bringing her food as she healed, and she was inviting me over to sit on her deck in the sunshine and laugh about old times. As I say, Peggy and I have a long history together, which includes many years where we only got together rarely. We've had many ups and downs, but when big things happen like a death, a marriage, or a new baby, we always reach out and are there for each other. Yet there have been times in my life when I felt I was done with the friendship. Either I would misread her or she would misread me, and then one or both of us would walk away confused, hurt. But throwing away friendships because they are difficult is not the solution. Friendships honestly can be exhausting. The exhaustion comes about in part because I'm trying to look at myself from inside the mind of someone else. That idea of peering out from another person's eyes and looking at oneself led to the quote by the existentialist Sartre. He wrote, "Hell is other people." He recognized that looking at ourselves as an object through the eyes of another is very demoralizing. It leaves you feeling a bit soulless. And while there's a lot of value to standing in someone else's shoes to gain empathy and compassion, at some point I must acknowledge that I can't crawl into my friend's mind to know all that she's thinking and feeling. And if we can't work it out, at some point I just have to step back and allow some time to pass and some grace to settle in and allow the misunderstanding to expire. And you may not believe this, but I often fall back on something I learned here from our UU community many years ago when I was serving on a committee. And I frequently find that this solves many worries, which is assume right intention. I even find myself with my kids when they're upset about a run-in they had with somebody at school saying, assume right intention. They love it when I say that to them. Don't get me wrong, there are relationships that you should walk away from. There are negative, toxic relationships that are emotionally draining and need to be ended. But on the whole, friends bring us so much joy and fun, and loneliness is at a pandemic level and causing pain and anxiety for so many. Friendship is the vaccine, I think, we can all take against this type of disease. Last summer, when I saw my old friend Peggy from grade school, we talked about how much our friendship means to us. We talked about our mistakes we had made in our relationship and vowed to do better and keep reaching out to each other no matter what as we age. I left feeling a weight had lifted from my shoulders, knowing that we could be honest with each other about our regrets, our mistakes, and our mutual desire to stay friends no matter what. Everyone at some point has had at least one friendship that's gone so wrong that they felt they might just give up on the friendship altogether. I know I have. But I keep trying because friends are important to me, to my mental health, and are a source of deep joy.
When I was a child, my family attended the Presbyterian Church in McMinnville, Oregon. My parents didn't particularly care about church, but my great Auntie Margie, who pretty much acted as my grandmother after my mother's mother died before I was born. And she thought that church was an important part of family life, and so Carrie and I went. We often went to the coast on the weekends, so I imagine that we only went about once a month or so, but it was enough to leave an impression. Our minister was a very nice man named Jack Hodges. In retrospect, the church was smaller than ours was. When I went back in my 30s for Annie Margie's memorial service, I was surprised to realize that the entire sanctuary was covered in yellow carpet, which matched the pews. But what I remember was a deep feeling of love and belonging. We colored pictures and talked about Jesus in our small Sunday school class. I sat next to Annie Margie and sang hymns during church. We had cookies and punch and church holiday potlucks in the fellowship hall. I remember singing Pass It On with my sister as a duet in front of the whole church, and I can still sing you every word of that song. And I remember being baptized when I was 8 or 9. That congregation was where I learned about God. And to be honest, most of what I learned about God, I learned through the warm relationships I had with the people there. My sister Carrie and I wore dresses and patent leather shoes. We colored pictures and sang songs. We ate cookies and drank punch after church. I wanted Jack Hodges to officiate my wedding when I grew up. Maya Angelou said, "People won't remember what you said or what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel." And maybe that's why I've always had such a fondness for church. Unitarian Universalism has a reputation for being a church of come-outers. Many of us didn't grow up Unitarian Universalist, though some of us did, of course. But most of us either belonged to a different kind of church as we were growing up, mostly Christian, either Protestant or Catholic, but some Jewish folks and a few from other faith traditions. And some of us, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest, were raised unchurched. We found this place as adults, looking for community and shared values. How many of you were raised in a different faith tradition? Will you just show me? Okay, good. We're good. We're good. Most of you will understand what I am talking about then. Those of us who are raised in a different tradition have the shared experience of trying to figure out what elements of the faith we grew up in that we want to keep and that which we want or need to let go of. For many of us, that's the dogma that went along with our previous traditions. It may have been a rigid belief in the virgin birth or the idea that the earth was only 4,000 years old, things that just don't sit right with our scientific bent. It may be that those traditions weren't welcoming to us because we weren't heterosexual, or we had family or friends who weren't. It may be because we married somebody from a different denomination. It could be that the rules about who could preach didn't sit right with us. I know those feelings. I had a warm relationship with Christianity even as my ideas changed. But as a lesbian in Oregon during the Oregon Citizens Alliance ballot measures in the early 90s to keep homosexuals from getting special rights, or to declare that the state wouldn't promote or encourage homosexuality along with a bunch of, shall we say, unsavory practices, that caused a rift for me. I'm going to speak about something related but different for a minute here. Some of this current hateful legislation that is being pushed in other states is similar to that which we fought in the early 90s. But it honestly feels less religious and more political these days. What is similar is that right-wing candidates are using small, vulnerable minority populations to fire up their base. The Don't Say Gay bill in Florida that prevents teachers from acknowledging families like mine and requires teachers to out students to their parents. The bill in Idaho that just passed the House that bans any medical services to transgender kids, not surgeries, but medical services. And terrifyingly, the suggestion from the governor of Texas that following your child's lead on who they are is somehow child abuse. All these laws won't protect kids or families. They will harm some of our most vulnerable populations. LGBTQ kids still have much higher rates of suicide, and this isn't inherent. It's a result of being bullied or disbelieved or feeling like God or your community won't accept who you are. I am so very grateful to religious communities of all types and varieties who affirm that trans and LGBTQ kids, like all kids, are created in the image of God and are whole and holy and beloved. So how do we deal with religious traditions that have hurt us? And how do we bring that into present experience? If we were taught to fear God, how do we come into a different kind of church, but one that still has beautiful stained glass windows of Jesus? Well, I'm going to come back to my central metaphor. We can toss the bathwater, those pieces of our previous traditions that caused us pain or harm, but we don't have to lose the baby. The church of my childhood taught me that we are all beloved children of God. Now, my definition of God has shifted pretty profoundly over time. But that sense that there is something bigger than myself, something worth paying attention to, that has stayed with me. That feeling of belonging and being beloved and having something to lean into has stayed with me. And that feeling that I was not alone. I didn't have to do it all. I had to do my share, but someone greater than me was in charge, and sometimes that's a really good feeling. I think that's one of the things that it's hardest to hold on to these days. In an era of corrupt politicians and partisan news, we have lost faith that the people in charge know what they're doing. During a pandemic, when wearing a mask became politicized, we feel like we have the sole responsibility to hold it all together. No one else is going to do it for us, so we have to do it all ourselves. And I miss that easy faith of my childhood. But I realize that I don't have to let go of anything I don't want to. We each have the freedom to figure out what works for us. If there are metaphors around Christianity or whatever tradition we grew up in, we don't have to ditch all of those. We can keep what works for us. Because I bet if you think about it, there's something from whatever you came out of that's worth holding on to. Maybe it was a sense of belonging. Maybe it was intergenerational community. Maybe it was the deep hospitality of punch and cookies for everyone. Maybe it was a deep and abiding faith that you didn't have to do this alone. Marcus Borg was a progressive Christian theologian who died about 10 years ago. There is a section in his book, Reading the Bible for the First Time, where he writes that both the liberals and the conservatives, or the progressives and the evangelicals, I couldn't find the quote because I didn't have the book with me, have erred. And I'm paraphrasing. But he said something like, conservatives believe that in order to be true, every word in the Bible must be literally true. And so they double down on biblical inerrancy. But on the other hand, liberals believe that because the Bible is clearly not factually correct, that it must not be true at all. But one needs to realize that whether or not something actually happened that way doesn't mean it isn't true. He talks about the truth in the stories. In his book, Convictions, How I Learned What Matters Most, he wrote, critical thinking is an unavoidable part of growing up. We do not become adults without it. But in the modern world, this stage often corrodes religious belief. Modern Western ways of thinking are very much shaped by the identity of truth with factuality, and generally accepted modern knowledge calls into question the factuality of much of the Bible and religions more generally. This is one of the problems some of us had in our earlier experiences with religion. This feeling that we simply couldn't believe some of the things we were being asked to believe. But for me, looking at things through the progressive lens that Borg does has let me find some deeper truths in the writings of the Hebrews and early Christians and their relationships with their God. Ideas like loving your neighbor as yourself. Ideas about feeding the hungry and caring for the poor. Ideas about rising up against domination systems and paying attention to who is cast out and why. Ideas like the Good Samaritan story of someone helping somebody from a completely different group, and not just helping him back up on the donkey, but paying his hotel bill. Stories of bravery and courage, and stories of a failure of courage, like Peter's denial of Jesus after his arrest. Cautionary tales of hubris and pride. Stories of forgiveness. Joseph, he of the coat of many colors, forgiving his brothers who literally threw him into a pit to die because they were jealous. We can choose what we take from the faith of our childhoods. My best friend Darby grew up Catholic and doesn't practice anymore. But when she had children, she realized that she really wanted a moment of gratitude in their days. And so she found a book of graces and chose one, and they said it together every night at the dinner table, together. Because a moment of quiet and gratitude was a value that she wanted to hold together. Dolores practices gratitude. Kate and Brian practice hospitality and building cross-cultural relationships. Richard works on friendships. What values are central to you or your family? How do you practice those? In our story this morning, we heard about a family who shared something important with their children from their pasts. It might be important to articulate your values. To say, in our family, we do this because we believe this. We can also say, in our congregation, we do this because we believe this. For example, in our congregation, we teach comprehensive sexuality education because we believe that informed consent is really important and that everyone has the right to have all their questions answered. Or, in our congregation, we work the Hope Food Pantry because we believe in caring for our neighbors. In his book, Convictions, Marcus Borg wrote, and I'm going to ask you to use your universal translators. If you don't like the word God, substitute holy or the best of us or love. It still works. He wrote, faith does not mean believing in the literal factuality of the stories, regardless of how improbable they may seem. Rather, faith is about something more important. It is about our relationship with God, about centering in God, being loyal or faithful to God, and about trusting in God. Faith is the opposite of hubris and anxiety. It is about our relationship with love, about being faithful to love, about trusting in love. Faith is the opposite of hubris and anxiety. And I imagine that most of us could use a reduction in anxiety these days. I wouldn't presume to think about hubris. But frankly, the world sometimes feels like it's falling apart. In these times, faith is what lets us keep trying. Facts, frankly, tell us to bury our heads in the sand because nothing is ever going to get better. Faith is what keeps us getting out of bed every day and doing the next right thing. The faith of our childhoods, the faith of our ancestors. There's a lot of good there, and you can just let the rest go, let it go, let it go. But keep the baby. Blessed be, and amen.